Last week we started the topic, are Mormons Christians. Last week we just covered the question. Is it a fair question to ask? What does it mean? Is it offensive? Why would we do this? And just a preliminary look at Mormonism and Christianity to see what's the basis for asking the question. If you're interested, I started taping them, so it is online if you're interested and want to go back. This week, what we're going to do is a brief look, very brief, if you look at the time and the amount of things I'm trying to cover. History according to Christianity from eternity past to now. So that'll be quick. It's certainly not exhaustive. It's going to just blow through it. The main point is just Mormonism has a different view of history. Now, I'm not talking about from Joseph Smith on. Obviously, he had some different views that we'll be looking at when we get into Mormon doctrine. But before we look at Mormon doctrine, I thought we'd do it a little differently than I've seen other people do the Mormonism introduction. We're going to go and look at what does Christianity believe is the history of time of the faith, and then later we'll look at some of Mormonism and see how they line up, where the similarities and differences are. So this is not going to be exhaustive, certainly, and I'm going to miss a lot of stuff, especially the Old Testament and the Big Book. But I will highlight things that will be important because either it lays the groundwork for some doctrine, it lays the groundwork for something else that happened later in history, or it's something that the Mormons may have a very different view on. So for a lot of you, it's probably just review. So whatever, try and suffer through it. The other thing is apologetics, church history. I'm just a nerd. I really like that stuff, so this gives me an excuse to put some of that in. And feel free to ask questions. I don't know how long this class is going to go. Well, today I do, but into the future, I don't know. It could be 4 weeks or 14. I don't know. Depends on how interested you are and how long I talk. Feel free to ask questions, interrupt. I'll just sail on here. Okay, so I'm starting. If you're looking at an outline, we did basically 1 through 5 last week on what's on there. So we're starting at point 6. What is knowable and how can we know it? And I'm not going to cover everything about philosophy and epistemology and everything here, but just to give an introduction, just so some terms and concepts are familiar. Epistemology, not necessarily where you have to know, but it's an interesting concept. It talks about, it answers the questions like, what is knowledge? How is it acquired? To what extent can anything be known? I mean, just because somebody makes a claim that something happened in history, is that automatically true? Is it automatically qualified as knowledge, or is it just a belief? And what's the difference between belief and knowledge? I mean, we don't have anybody that was there in 2000 BC or whatever. So when we see competing claims or any claim, how do we know this is reasonable to believe and this is not? Or even with current things, what's justified, what's reasonable? Epistemology deals with that, and we're not really going to get into that, except just throw the word out there and talk about 3 related issues that are key to epistemology, and those are definitions of truth, belief, and justification. I don't mean justification like justification of faith. I mean justification like you'd use the word in court, although we'll get to the other one later. So truth, on the Christian view, well, on a secular view as well, most people, this does not apply to relativists or postmoderns, but most people will agree there is such thing as truth. It exists, it's objective, and it can be known, at least to some degree. Maybe we don't have access to everything, but there are things that are knowable, which sounds kind of like a silly thing to say, but there are a lot of people that don't accept that. So I like laying that out there. Certainly that is consistent with Christianity, and it's consistent with most philosophy of history and religion. And a good way to think of truth, because when people start talking about that's your truth, not mine, or what is true, a good way, kind of a shorthand definition of truth, is correspondence to reality. So if you see things that are real, and then you see claims about those things, do they correspond? If so, good chance it's true. If not, it's probably not. Sounds simple, but that's truth. Okay, so knowledge gets a little bit more interesting, and there's a lot of debate on this, some recently. pretty much since Plato, what the definition that's kind of been accepted for knowledge is justified true belief. So it's a belief, it's something that you believe, but there's a lot of crazy beliefs out there that we wouldn't want to call knowledge. So in addition to being a belief, it has to be true, otherwise it's kind of silly to even humor it. That's a different thing if we're talking about false beliefs. But if we're talking about true beliefs, then we're talking about justified true beliefs. And what we mean by justification, we can't prove things. Knowledge doesn't equal certainty. Knowledge equals, what can we know and what qualifies as knowledge. So to that end, we want to make sure that it's justified. We have some basis to say that this belief that we have is true. So again, I'm not going to get too deep in this. That's the end of that. My point is, I guess, if we're going to look at anything, this is where Christianity, I think, stands alone. There's all kinds of religions out there. There are religions that say, here are these beliefs, hold to them with a death grip based on blind faith. And that's the basis of our religion. You can do that, I guess, but that doesn't fit the category of knowledge, and that doesn't interest me. There are also faiths that say, or belief systems, worldviews, religions, that will say Mormonism, we made reference, that you're supposed to read this book and keep asking God, read it, ask God, is this true, until you get a burning in your bosom. Okay, we'll talk about that later, but is a subjective experience enough? Maybe for some things, for some people, but that's not Christianity. Christianity is not seeking to work yourself into a fervor or get some kind of internal feeling. There's also religions that you count on things like mantras. Repeat this over and over, do this act over and over until you feel it. Fake it till you make it, whatever. There's all these different ideas that there are all other religions that can be looked at, certainly, but I think Christianity stands alone because Christianity is creedal. Christianity makes statements that it claims can be verified by different means, and we'll get to that. And I think it does a good job holding up to that. So I would say if you're looking at the journey to find truth when it relates to a religion, from my perspective, it seems like if you can't establish that the basic premise of a religion is justified true belief, I wouldn't go any farther. I mean, if you can pursue it, you can study whatever, but it seems to me more interesting, or if you're going to commit your life to something, that it would be something that's justifiable, that you can prove there's something to it. And I think Christianity fits that, and that's part of the case I'm going to build as we go through history, and then we'll compare Mormonism, see if it does the same. Briefly, too, I want to lay out a definition, just a working definition of faith. Faith is one of those words that's thrown around in a lot of settings, and it can have a lot of meanings. And depending on the setting, it's that different meanings are appropriate. I think just because people don't think about it a whole lot or don't think about it carefully, I think usually the term faith is, the word blind is in parentheses, and it's just assumed that when you say faith, it's an unjustified belief in the absurd. I mean, that's kind of what people say when they say faith, especially derogatorily. I believe in this because I have faith. Well, faith isn't a justification for a belief. That's something else. What I would say, I think a better word, especially when looking biblically, especially in the New Testament, when you see things about faith, it's more talking about trust. It's a basis that there is a reason to believe that something is true and to place your trust in it. So on Christianity, some of the basic views: is there a God? And is there any good reason to trust Him? So what would be the bases for that? Certainly there's personal experience, that can play into it. Correspondence to reality. If there were a God, I would expect certain things to be true of the world. Do I see those things true of the world or not? And if so, not a slam dunk argument, but I think it does lend a lot of weight to pushing us in the direction that there's a God and He ought to be, there's a good reason to trust Him. Intuition, what does our mind tell us about what is? There's logical and philosophical arguments, our moral sense. There's a number of different things we can use as a basis for establishing whether there's a God, whether He ought to be trusted, these kind of things. Are there good reasons to believe the Bible is true? Got history, archaeology, science, again, I can't use archaeology to prove anything about of salvation by faith, grace, that kind of thing. That I'm not going to find that in archaeology. But when there are when there are claims that relate to places, dates, people, things that can be found, do we find corroboration? Does it correspond with reality? And I think it does. Are there good reasons to believe in Christianity? We've got eyewitness testimony. We've got first-hand accounts recorded in the Bible. The claims of Christianity agree with the Bible. Agree with secular history. There's something called inference to the best explanation, which means when you look at all the facts, does it seem like it points more this way or that way? So I think Christianity holds up based on all this with this word faith, that we have a reason to put our trust in this system, in the beliefs and the claims of this religion. I think there's reason to place trust in that. I don't think that we just need to, white knuckle it and hope that it's true. What we'll look at is do other religions have equal basis? Can they do the same thing? Specifically Mormonism, because that's what we're talking about here. So does Mormonism have, for their books, for their teachings, for all the things that correspond to what Christianity looks to, do they have similar basis for that? And we'll get to that later. We're going to do Christianity now. So I'm going to start eternity past and whip through, like I mentioned before, quick view of history. And here and there, I'll throw in what our basis is for believing a certain thing. A lot of the times, the things I'm throwing out there are because they establish a doctrine. Or you'll see later, oh, that's where that doctrine came from, that belief in Christianity. So, eternity past and Christianity, God existed. He is, was, has been. The phrase, the name he introduced himself with was I am, which implies a lot of things. He just always has been, changeless. From eternity past, he was a personal being, according to the Bible. And according to, I think there's a good logical reasoning that makes sense there. Things that aren't persons don't cause other things to come into being. So persons make decisions. So God was a personal being, and is. God is a spirit. That's throughout the Bible. And a spirit, meaning immaterial, not having a body. There's certainly a lot that's contained in that, but just want to touch on that for this point. God is triune. This we could go off on for a long time. This is not a teaching that's explicitly taught in the Bible. You won't find a passage that says, now we're going to tease out the Trinity. It's not there. But throughout the Bible, you will see Jesus called God, the Holy Spirit called God, and the Father called God. You'll see them. You'll see all these their identities explained and referred to, and where it ended up, which we'll see later. The concept of the Trinity is three in person, but one in essence. They're all the same stuff called God. They're all the same stuff, but they're three unique persons or centers of consciousness. But that's all say on the Trinity. We should settle the topic. It's pretty simple. God, from eternity past, was perfect, which brings a lot of things in. Typically, you think of things like complete, lacking nothing. He wasn't just sitting around going, if only there were people. Then I would feel fulfilled and life would be complete. He was complete and lacked nothing. There's only one God. That's all kinds of that throughout the Bible. Just one example, Isaiah 45:22. I am God and there is none else. Pretty clear. He said he's God and there are no other gods, so there's one. So we call that monotheism, one God, belief in one God. Logic tells us that there's one God as well. If we're going to believe that there is a God, and one of the parts of God's definition is omnipotence, meaning you're the greatest in power, the greatest, maximal amount of ability. Well, if there's two, then you're not, because you can't both be the greatest. So there's one God. So that's eternity past. God existed, and that was basically what existence was God. God was timeless in the sense that because God is changeless, there's nothing that, at one point he had these beliefs, now he has these beliefs, or, he used to be a bad guy and then he, straightened up or whatever. Because he's changeless, time, philosophy of time is a weird subject, but time basically is the measurement of change. So when something changes, now you have two different states of affairs, and you go, okay, so now I can measure the distance between them and call that time. Well, if all that exists is a changeless entity, then there is no time in that sense. So that's what we talk about, really. Time came into being in the beginning. So this lines up, science has all kinds of views on the beginning. Genesis 1:1 calls it, in the beginning God created, and there was nothing and then there was. And I think they correlate very well. But the basic belief is, at the beginning of space, time, and matter, all that there was is God. He created everything that was, and he did it what's called ex nihilo. A lot of times they like to use Latin phrases just because English words change meaning. Latin doesn't. All it means is from nothing. That God didn't come in with a set of Legos or a bunch of clay and form it into things. There was nothing, and then there was something created from nothing. If you're talking to an atheist, well, any skeptic really, especially an atheist materialist, that's a fun one to talk about. They can talk about evolution, they can talk about change. Fine. You're talking about somebody rearranging the Legos, and building stuff out of the clay. Where is the clay from? How did you get the stuff to begin with? And that's where the conversation usually goes off into weird things that don't make any sense. But so that's in the beginning. Sometime after that, we've got this stretch of Genesis. We don't really have dates for it and can't even guess. Well, we can guess. Plenty of people have guessed. Doesn't really matter. But up in the early parts of Genesis, we don't really know exactly when it happened or what the stretch was. There are things that we do know very plainly. We, humans, were part of God's creation. We were created in His image, but with a different nature. I think it's just common sense, and most people that have even cracked the Bible would agree that the things that it says about God's nature and the things it says about man's nature sound like different things, different beings. That will become important. In Christianity, we and God are different. We experience relationship with God. There's an open relationship of communication, worship, whatever. In Adam and Eve's sin, what we call the fall, this relationship with God was fundamentally changed. So separation from God is the new normal. Now it's not communion with God and access to God unimpeded. Now there's this thing between us that of our own creation, that we've, well, anyway, there's the beginning of Genesis. A few chapters later, God brings a flood into the world, in judgment of the world. Saved from the flood were Noah and his family. Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. One interesting thing, this has nothing to do with Mormonism. There's little parts that will, but it was interesting to me, so I get to say it. Okay, Noah had 3 kids, right? Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The sons of Shem were called Semites. Heard that word before? So you hear Semitic cultures. That's anyone that somehow descended from the line of Shem, which is way more than the Jews. It's a lot of people. Now, when the Nazis talked about being anti-Semitic, that was they weren't really anti-Semitic. They were picking on the Jews specifically. But Semitic, as a word, specifically does mean descendants of Shem. So you get in the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Amalekites, the whole list. Then Shem had a great-grandson named Eber. Eber's descendants were called Hebrews. So when you see Hebrews, they were 3 generations down from Shem. So all Hebrews are Semites, not all Semites are Hebrews. So when I was trying to figure this out, I'm reading the Bible, looking at these charts, and I had to make this diagram to try and understand it. It amused me, but probably no one else. 6 generations later, after Eber, came Abram. Okay? Kind of a big deal. He's in the Bible a lot. So Abraham was both a Semite and a Hebrew, just for clarity. Sometime between Eber and Abram, and we don't know when specifically, the nations gathered together to make a name for themselves. That's the phrase used in the Bible. What's this called? Anyone know what the story this is?
Tower of Babel.
Tower of Babel. It's 9 whole verses, I think, or 11, something like that. It's very brief, beginning of Genesis 11. Very short story, and it's funny. I have loaded in my head all these ideas about the Tower of Babel. Read the story if you're interested. It ain't in there. There's a whole bunch of stuff that comes from, who knows, VeggieTales or assumptions. It's not bad stuff necessarily. Look, for instance, the Tower of Babel, not in the Bible. It's a heading that they put at the top of Genesis 11, so we know where we're at. It was a big pyramid in the Valley of Shinar, which some people think was Sumer, where the Sumerians are from, which doesn't really matter unless you're a nerd and like those details. So, stop that. So the people built a city with a tower that they thought would reach the sky. God put an end to this by confusing their language and shipping them off all over. The structures, we refer to the Tower of Babel. That comes from the Hebrew word balal, which means to jumble. In their word puzzles, so they did monuments, I guess. So this account is just from the brief summary in, like I said, the beginning of Genesis 11. It's referred to a few other places. But it is not proven, but it is consistent with archaeology, other history, other findings. And because of that, because of the materials that would have been used, the peoples, the motivation for doing this, when you compare to what was happening in the world and when those names of places and peoples existed, current scholars put the event somewhere between 3500 BC and 2400 BC, for whatever it's worth, if you're interested. Just kind of going chronologically, that gives us about where that likely happened. Big span, but we're in that range. Why did they do this? It's interesting. There's not a whole lot in that passage about why. A lot of speculation, and I think probably a lot of it is correct, but a lot of the things that I had thought that I've probably heard or assumed or made up on my own aren't in there. So it's an interesting read. Maybe they thought they could reach God. Maybe they thought that doing this, in a sense, made them God. But they said they wanted to make a name for themselves, to show that they were the top dog in the area. So, I see those kind of things, and even though it's not in the story, I gotta believe there's something to that people are trying to reach God. It doesn't say that in the story. That's what I assume, that they're building a tower to God, maybe they can find it. It doesn't say that, but that makes sense. And even if they weren't doing it intentionally, explicitly, I think that's probably what's underlying it all. I think it still happens today. Throughout history, we've got a record of people doing things to fill this God-shaped hole. There's some hole left since the fall, and people are doing something, they're trying to pursue different means to fill this hole. And I think that's consistent with that. Not only have men always sought this, there's reconciliation. God has always been seeking reconciliation as well. From the fall, there's allusions where God talks about already his plan for bringing a Savior. There's all this foreshadowing, talking about Christ coming that no one got until after it happened. Then they started to figure out what all that foreshadowing was talking about. So the consistent message throughout the Old Testament is telling a story about the coming Messiah, using a bunch of stories around it to build what the Messiah is coming. You can read the whole Old Testament to see what I mean. Or some summaries that are interesting. Peter's speech, 2nd chapter of Acts, I believe, where he gives kind of an overview of our people, and how we came to be, and how this Messiah came. Stephen, when he was stoned, gave a cool speech that was similar but different in Acts 7, where he kind of just gives the Cliff's Notes version of the Old Testament. So that's a good place to start, just give you an overview. Around 2100 BC, we're with Abram again. God tells him that he's going to make him a great nation would come from him, and that the Messiah would come through his line. Now, you won't see the language of Messiah then, back with Abram, but the terminology and the framework hadn't yet been revealed. But if you look at what's throughout Genesis 12:3, 18:17, 22:18, there's these places where God makes the initial promise and then keeps revisiting it. Remember when I said this? I haven't forgotten you. This is going to happen. I'm going to do this through you. After waiting 10 years from the first promise, Abram figured he needed to help God a little bit, so that's when he, well, I guess it was more Sarah's idea, I don't know. But, so he ends up having a kid with the slave girl who's not his wife. Ishmael comes of that. There's a whole other fork, we could go in another religion, but we won't. Islam has a very different view from that point on what happened. After Ishmael's born, God, I think, basically puts Abraham in a timeout. Says, okay, I thought I told you I would do this. I kept saying it over and over. You tried to do it on your own, whatever. So it's interesting when you read stories like Abraham and Joseph and stuff, and it reads very quickly, but if you look at the things that are happening, you realize 13 years. I mean, Ishmael was 13 years when Isaac was born. That's a while to go from all these promises and then just silence. I think maybe God thought, okay, I told you to wait, and you waited 10 years, and took it in your own hands. Maybe we'll go another 13 just to make a point, you know. But end of 13 years, God changes his name to Abraham, sent another son named Isaac. Then when Isaac's born, Ishmael and his mom Hagar are sent away. So now Isaac, God repeats the promise to Isaac that he made to Abraham, that this great people and Messiah will come through your line. Does the same thing through Jacob when Jacob is born, who was Isaac's son. So Jacob's name is changed to Israel. Around 1800 BC, God, through the people who are Jacob's descendants, are called Israelites. So Abraham was not an Israelite. Abraham was not a Jew. Jacob was not an Israelite. He was Israel. So just not that it's it's kind of a big deal, really. We talk about the Jews, but who the Jews are is, it's a specific thing, and we tend to apply it to a lot of things. So I think it's interesting to see who's who. So the Israelites begin around 1800 BC with Jacob's children. After that, there's a severe famine. Jacob and his 12 sons leave Canaan and settle in Goshen in northern Egypt. While they're there, Pharaoh makes them slaves. So they get to work for the Egyptian government. And this, again, like I mentioned before, these are confirmable things. Obviously, we have the biblical record, archaeology, Egyptian history. There are references, not to the Israelites, but there are words similar to the word Hebrew that sure sound like it could, lines up. They're slaves that were taken from another land, and things that maybe is not 100% corroborating evidence, but it fits. Yeah.
Okay, so they're Israelites, and they're also Hebrew, and they're also Semites.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
But, since you brought that up, Semites, Babylonians and Assyrians are also Semites. They're going to come into the story later doing mean things to the Israelites. So they're all Semites, family fights, whatever, So it is interesting when you start to see who these people are and what the interplay is. To me it is anyway. I should say it's interesting. It may not be. Soon you'll be done with it. So, okay, so 1450 BC roughly, after 400 years of slavery, see how fast we're going? It's 400 years. God raises up Moses to lead the Hebrews, the people of Israel, call them what you will, out of Egypt. They wander in the wilderness for 40 years until they enter the land God promised to them. Again, that 40 years was a lot longer in the Bible than it is in the outline. The people of Israel want a system to, it's a lot of people, millions of them. God put into effect judges, a system of judges to rule them, to set up the rules and decide, on disputes between them. Then they came whining to God and said, well, the other countries are kings, we want kings. So God said, okay, whatever. Got rid of the judges, gave them kings. And that worked out really well. So now, 950 BC, one of the kings, Solomon, built a temple in Jerusalem where God could be among his people. After Solomon died, we got 12 tribes of Israel, right? And the 10 in the north and 2 in the south, more or less, just a little bit of crossover, but the 10 in the north are called what? The people of Israel. And the 2 in the south, Tim? There you go. So you got Israel and Judah, 10 and 2, north and south. Okay, so they were scattered. Okay, all the 10 tribes were in different regions, where they camped. Not like campground, like big camp, like countries, whatever, enormous. Big areas. And that's just how they settled. And it just happened to be the 10 on the top and the two that were towards the bottom split. Solomon's kid, Rehoboam, the 10 in the north didn't want to follow him, so they split. So you got the 10 and 2, that's when it became, okay, these 10, which used to go by the 10 tribe names, now go by the name Israel. They still maintain the tribes for sure, but and the 2 at the bottom go by Judah. Then you see lines of kings in each kingdom. They got the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. A little bit later, if I say Judea, that's the Greek and Roman name for the Hebrew word Judah. Same people group, same region. So, Israel and Judah split, right, over Rehoboam. After 200 years, this is the people of Israel, the north. After 200 years, they're conquered by, anyone know who? This crazy obscure Bible trivia.
Assyrians?
Yeah, the Assyrians. Israel is conquered by the Assyrians after 200 years of being a nation. What happens after that to the people of Israel, not Judah? Anyone know?
They're taken to exile.
And then after exile, what?
Come back
They come back.
gradually, but
Not Israel,
Not as Israel, but
just Judah.
just Judah.
Israel, the people of Israel, ceased to be after the Assyrian. I mean, sure there were people, but intermarrying, dispersion, whatever. Okay, after the Assyrians take them, 10 tribes. Just it goes away. I mean, the people of Israel. The story ends for the people of Israel, biblically. And so, do they exist today? I think you would have to say that they maintained intermarriage by tribe, which I think is a hard argument to make, because if they did, you'd hear about it. And we don't hear about it, so do they exist? Maybe, but I think it's a tough argument to make. So that's Israel. Judah, the remainder, the remnant, the 2 tribes to the south, about a century after the Israelites are taken by Assyria, Judah fell to who? Babylonians, under Nebuchadnezzar. He comes in and rolls over not only Jerusalem and takes them into captivity, but Nebuchadnezzar destroys Solomon's temple. So that was called the first temple. It's gone, wipes it out. Not much evidence of it can be found, but also not a lot of people like you digging around on that dome of the mount, so there's not a lot of excavation going on there. But, so the house of Judah is taken to Babylon the same time that Israel is in Assyria. Eventually, Babylon was conquered by Persia, and the Persian king Cyrus the Great allowed anyone who wished, which would be the people of Judah, as well as other people who wanted to tag along to Jerusalem that weren't necessarily people of Judah or Jews at all. Well, I shouldn't say Jews, who weren't people of Judah is the most accurate way to say it. If they were not of that line, he let them go if they wanted to go to, in a gold rush, found in a new city and build the temple. So Cyrus the Great let them leave, and Ezra and Nehemiah lead this, and they build what's called the Second Temple. So they rebuild the temple, and that's when you hear a reference to the Second Temple. That was built under Ezra and Nehemiah's leadership when a remnant of Judah returned. So you got all these people, and then just the people of Judah, and then only a portion of them go back. And then I mentioned these tag-alongs that go with them that weren't people of Judah. Very interesting, again, to me. If you read when Jesus is talking about the people in Palestine, he refers to the good figs and the bad figs. He's talking about the good figs are the leftover, the real deal, the people of Judah, who is all that's left of the original chosen people. The bad figs are all the tag-alongs that came with them. And once you start seeing this language and who's who, a lot of that starts to clear up, I think. So we're about 400 BC. Ezra and Nehemiah come back and begin to build the temple. The Old Testament ends. That's when there is no more history recorded in the Old Testament. And we've got this gap of 400 years in the Bible between writings of the Old Testament and writings of the New Testament. That doesn't mean history stopped or that people stopped writing. there are hundreds of books referred to as a group called the Apocrypha that record what happened in that time. They're not accepted as canonical for a number of reasons I'll get to in a second. The Catholic Church does include a number of them. I don't know, maybe a dozen or so. There are hundreds of them. There's a lot out there, and they're pick and choose depending on what your motivations are and what you're looking for. They're not canonical. They don't line up with the Bible, but there's a lot of truth in them. If you want to look at history, what happened in those 400 years? A lot of it's laid out in Maccabees and things like that. So, just briefly, the reason they were excluded from the canon, Jesus didn't quote from any of the apocryphal books. He quoted from books were kept in, when they talked about books in the Old Testament, well, throughout the Bible, when they talked about the law and the prophets, they had scrolls that were rolled up, kept as collections. Here's the law. So you've got, the Torah, you got the first 5 books, what we call the Old Testament. For prophets, you've got the grouping of prophetic writings. So, and I think the Jews grouped them in something like 5 sections of writings. So though Jesus didn't necessarily quote from every book in the Old Testament, he quoted extensively from those groups. So, if he would have been, now, okay, we're going to take for granted Jesus is God. We're Christians, I think that's fair right now. And we'll get to that later. But if Jesus is God, and God comes to earth to talk to people, and he's going to bring in a book like the law or the prophets, but there was something in there that was crazy. Daniel, he was nuts. But that would be the time to say so. So this is one of the primary reasons that we look and see what we bring in and call canon and what we exclude is, did Jesus refer either to that book or to the collection it was a part of? Because he would have said something if it didn't belong. Also, these apocryphal books existed. If the Jews had wrongly excluded them, I think Jesus probably would have said, oh, by the way, you guys have ignored these books. You shouldn't. There's some good stuff here. I don't think you would just, let it sit on a shelf and say, oh, it's just too bad that these people didn't get all the rest of the truth, The Apocrypha, all written in either Greek or Latin, not written in Hebrew. If you know anything about Jews, they have this thing with their culture and tradition. They wouldn't they wouldn't have abandoned their tongue, their language, to write books that if they considered them to be authoritative. None of them claim inspiration. You don't read, God told me this, I'm supposed to pass it on. The Jews didn't accept them. The doctrines contained within them contradict Christian and Jewish practices. Things like praying to the dead. This is a bad thing to Jews. I mean, you get in big trouble for that. It was explicitly said in the law, you don't pray to the dead. You don't have anything to do with the dead. There's all these, clean and unclean. So there wouldn't be things that explicitly contradicted their practices. There's also explicit contradictions with canonical books and within themselves, or even within a book, sometimes you'll be reading something. You said this a little bit ago, how it contradicts itself. So that, I think, would be a good point to stop, I guess. That brings us to, we'll leave it at 400 BC, okay? Although the Apocrypha was written over that 400-year period, we'll pick up at 300 or 400 and just cover the, Israel changing hands a few times, just to kind of set the stage for the New Testament, and then crash through the New Testament and early church history and the early councils next week. Any questions? Interesting at all, or is it just for me? Because I like it just for me.
Great.
As I'm doing this, there's a lot of stuff out there. There's full courses online and all kinds of stuff out there. If anyone's interested in any of those topics, let me know. There's tons out there. We just covered a little bit, but glad to have you.
Great.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Scott. That's good.